Much has been said about resistance in Ukraine. Palestinians will occasionally resist and be deemed terrorists in the Western media.
There's this failure to see the land of Palestine as occupied. Zionists believe, or they're pretending to believe, that they are not occupiers, no matter what international law says. No matter the fact that they literally came from all over the world to inhabit land that is not theirs. They continue to be engaged in an exercise of taking more and more land from Palestinians. Uzi Dayan, a former Israeli army general and member of Israel's parliament, warned Palestinians of another Nakba, speaking about a possible civil war situation. Part of you is acknowledging that not only do we exist, but that we're part of you.
Also, it acknowledges you as civil, right? Because you can't have a civil war if you're uncivilized. Bennett keeps talking about that new wave of terrorism. Land Day commemorates the old wave of terrorism.
Hello and welcome to episode 50 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GossenGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram. And Mikey Intifada, if you've been talking about the terrorist attacks, but you don't mean the Palestinian children killed this week.
Yes, absolutely, Michael. Very, very timely. But we're here on episode 50, which is kind of insane.
Truly wild.
All in less than a year, actually. Or maybe just
it's been a year, which means
exactly.
We've put out a podcast pretty much every week for a full year.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And while one day I would hope that we no longer have to exist, until that day.
You're talking about the podcast, not Palestinians, because that's you just Zionist wet dream alert. You know what I mean?
Yes. I'm talking about the podcast. Until then, yeah, it's been an incredible ride. We have talked to so many amazing Palestinian leaders, other allies, scholars, activists, people on the ground, people in exile, musicians, artists, everybody. It's been such a diverse group of guests that we've had. And I'm really looking forward to just the next 50, who, just continue to build this incredible base of knowledge of Palestinians and those who support Palestinians in their struggle for justice and self-determination. And it's been super amazing. We've had a lot of great feedback too. We're still the Zionists there's a handful of Zionists that have found us on Apple Podcasts, but what's hilarious is that we're still 4.9. Thank you, but
nice try.
The people who listen show up and they leave reviews and they leave comments, and we're so appreciative of every single one of you all who are here on this ride with us.
We have interviewed some brilliant minds and spoken to some people at the forefront of Palestinian resistance and liberation. And I'm so overwhelmed and humbled by the whole thing. And just love all the community that we're building online and on our spaces, whether it's the Instagram or on our Patreon, anywhere, anybody who's engaged with us. I'm super appreciative. We honestly wouldn't be on the internet still if it wasn't for you all. So thank you so much to everybody who's engaged. And congrats on the engagement. You know what I mean? Hope y'all tie the knot at some point.
I was wait, are you saying congrats to us? I was about to say thank you, Michael, because congrats to us.
So much has been said about acts of resistance in Ukraine, right? How it is admirable, how it is a duty, how it is glorified when people resist occupation in Ukraine. And then suddenly, Palestinians will occasionally resist and be automatically deemed terrorists in the Western-facing media.
The BBC article that I'm looking at is talking about how a Palestinian quote unquote gunman killed 5 people in a suburb of Tel Aviv, which makes it the 3rd deadly attack of its kind in a week. And the 2 attacks that took place prior to that were committed by Palestinian citizens of Israel. The BBC is referring to them, of course, as Israeli Arabs.
Right.
And those 2 attacks left 6 people dead.
A number of Palestinian resistance fighters have targeted people inside the occupation, police, soldiers, individuals, and there's going to be a lot of people who condemn them and try and distance themselves and say that this is totally unacceptable. I've seen that from a lot of so-called Jewish allies. And I just want to say Palestinians have the right to resist occupation with violence according to the UN.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know who has reported this, but I've seen at least one media organization try to say that this is like the work of ISIS, or that ISIS is taking responsibility for these latest acts. ISIS can say whatever they want. Like, they can say they take responsibility for anything. That doesn't mean that it is ISIS.
I bombed at stand-up and they took credit for it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, who knows? They're taking credit for a lot of shit.
They're like, Michael Schertzer last weekend, Santa Barbara, that was us.
Wow. Not you with a specific time and place, like you're attending my shows. You're not. And I wasn't in Santa Barbara last weekend.
I know. I just had Santa Barbara in the brain because of that murder.
You just did the damn, like, clue. I want to solve the murder. Like, Michael with the candlestick.
In Santa Barbara. They say one of the media organizations is saying that the individual who killed 4 people in a stabbing and car ramming rampage was a Palestinian citizen of Israel. They say that he was previously imprisoned for trying to join ISIS in Syria.
Wow, they imprison people for that? I thought they'd pay for it.
Yeah, right? I don't know. I have no
I guess he didn't apply for the ISIS Israeli scholarship.
Yeah. I don't know.
Cue the moment where Benjamin Netanyahu is like holding the hand of an ISIS fighter.
Yeah. Then they say that with respect to one of the other attacks where a Palestinian man killed 5 people, including a police officer with an assault rifle in the suburb of Tel Aviv, that act was not claimed by anyone. 3 out of the 5 people who were killed were not Jewish. They were two were foreign workers, and 1 was a Palestinian Christian. For at least one of the individuals, we know that he comes from one of the northern villages in the occupied West Bank. And so this is a guy who's lived under occupation. He's lived.
One of them is from Jenin.
Yeah, he's lived witnessing Israeli occupation his entire life. He's experienced it every single day of his life. So maybe that's a relevant thing to add, like, to this analysis.
Those same news organizations that are quick to vilify Palestinians will be very quick to defend settlers who commit terrorism all the time, right? People who burn down people's houses, murder children, stab goats. You know what I mean? They're doing like BuzzFeed things like, which goat would you stab? Like, it's not a culture that really has the ability to self-reflect. And furthermore, they do like puff pieces on white shooters in the United States, right? If a person in the United States goes on like a shooting rampage and they're white, they take a photo from a picnic they had one time and cover every single mental illness or like pill that they've ever ingested.
Yep.
Like, he was once bullied in 3rd grade, and that is why he loaded the semi-auto. Meanwhile, a Palestinian who has been under occupation forever since they were born picks up one day and decides they've had enough. And everybody's like, I fully don't understand this terrorist. It's like, all right, well, maybe you don't want to.
Of course, Naftali Bennett is saying that the country is dealing with a new wave of terrorism. But, let's be very clear about this. If these people are at all motivated by the fact their country has been under occupation for the last 70-some years, and they are engaging in this type of armed resistance as a means to combat that, then it's very bizarre to paint them as just terrorists when at the same time we are totally supporting and glorifying the same exact actions that Ukrainians and average Ukrainians, like Ukrainian civilians, are engaging in. Like that's what was also so interesting about watching this situation in Ukraine. It's not just like the Ukrainian military. It's like anybody get up and go to the local town square and pick up a Molotov cocktail, and that person is being so glorified by the U.S. media. I think it's also really interesting because the Israeli news has been like in a total frenzy ever since people started making the comparison between Palestinian resistance and Ukrainians resisting Russian occupation and invasion. And they have put out a bunch of different pieces. Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, pro-Zionist media organizations have put out a bunch of like response pieces. Some of them have responded to like Gigi Hadid's post saying like hands off Ukraine, hands off Palestine. And they've all been like, no, it's not the same thing, and this is why. I just want to rebut very quickly what a lot of these Israeli newspapers are saying when they say that Ukraine is not Palestine, no matter what celebrities say. This is what one of the headlines in response to Gigi Hadid's post. It's very interesting because they think that they've come up with this like amazing rebuttal, right? That they've, dismissed everything that she has to say, and that, oh, she's just a model, she's stupid, whatever. She's not coming with like a real proper analysis. Here's the real analysis.
We love the misogyny in their immediate response,
Yes.
right? She's so dumb. She's just a model. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Listen to us, the progressives.
Okay, so this is the best part. There's so much misogyny in this. The Jerusalem Post article says, literally, Hadid might be competent walking down the runway, but when it comes to expressing her views on international affairs, she's in way over her lingerie.
Is that for real?
That's from the Jerusalem Post. I swear to God. Yes, that's for real.
That sounds like Elliot's manifesto from Santa Barbara.
Yes, 100%. And if y'all don't remember who Michael's talking about, it's this dude who just like murdered a bunch of people a few years back because like girls wouldn't sleep with him.
In Santa Barbara, which is pretty difficult, honestly.
And it came to light after he himself, because I think he was he killed by the police, or did he?
I think he killed himself.
I think he killed himself. But it came out afterwards that he had written this entire manifesto about how like he hates all women because none of them would sleep with him. Anyways, all right. So what they're saying is Ukraine doesn't threaten to race Russia off the map and then shoot 4,500 rockets at it as Palestinian terrorists did to Israel during the last Israel-Gaza war. So first of all, they seem to have some amnesia about the fact that they were shelling Gaza at a level that far exceeds anything that Palestinians were doing to Israel. But even looking at a more macro level, the premise is faulty. Obviously, right now, Ukrainians, civilians, and the army are engaged in armed resistance against Russian occupiers on Ukrainian soil. I mean, does anybody dispute this? Like, I don't think anybody does. And there's this failure to see the land of Palestine as occupied. Zionists believe that, or they're pretending to believe, that they are not occupiers, no matter what international law says, no matter the fact that they literally came from all over the world to inhabit land that is not theirs, and that they are consistently and that they continue to be engaged in an exercise of taking more and more land from Palestinians. They are doing it until now. And at the same time, they're telling you that it's not the same thing because Ukraine doesn't threaten to erase Russia off the map, while they themselves are engaged in the very active exercise of erasing Palestine off the map and then questioning why Palestinians are resisting.
They'd be like, we're not occupiers, and that's why we need to raise Gaza.
Yeah, we're not occupiers, but that's why we need to expel all these Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah.
We're not occupiers, but that's why they stand in checkpoint lines for 10 hours.
We're not occupiers, but that's why we're building hundreds and hundreds of Jewish settlements. That's just kind of the occupied West Bank, where, again, we don't limit our analysis only to that specific area.
The whole of so-called Israel is a settlement.
Exactly. But the point is that the notion that they even have to call something a settlement in and of itself is proof that it's not theirs and that they weren't there. If you have to settle there, it means that you were not there previously.
It means you came
don't have to,
recently.
Yeah, exactly. Palestinians don't have to settle because we just were.
Yes, Palestinians are already there. They're also trying to be like, oh, but like they're fighting against the Russian army. And it's like, don't y'all have mandatory army service? Aren't nearly all of you in at least some sort of ancillary organization that supports the occupation? The so-called Israeli military is actually a super well-funded military operation, and they train all the time. Like, you see videos on TikTok every single day of them shooting targets that look like Palestinians.
Yes.
You remember
100%.
the target? Do you remember the target that had a Palestinian mother who was pregnant and a baby, and it said something like 2 for 1 or something like that?
Yeah, it said 1 shot, 2 kills.
1 shot, 2 kills.
Yeah, and they turn it into a t-shirt and they sell it literally in like, tourist stalls all over like Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Insane.
What type of message does that send to the native population who's walking around Jerusalem and sees a target of a woman in a hijab who's pregnant, and there's literally a bullseye on her belly? Like, you want to talk to us about terrorism? You want to talk to us about terrorism? Y'all don't own fucking mirrors over there? You know what I mean? How do you not see the connection between your existence in the land you're in and terrorism? Let's talk about Tantura. I can't stop thinking about it. I'll be trying to think about jokes from my set at night, and all I can think about is Tantura. Let's talk about any of the massacres. There are a number of them, some which didn't even get reported. We do our best to try and cover and relive the memories of people who survived it. But let's talk about the numbers. If that's what you want to do, if you want to reduce people to numbers, let's talk about the numbers of people who are piled up, whose bodies are held by the occupation, can't be buried. Ahmed Erekat. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about terrorism. Let's talk about gunning people down for no reason. I'm happy to have the conversation. I don't think they are. I don't think they would like to genuinely engage in a conversation about who gets assassinated regularly.
Iyad Halak, the Palestinian who was special needs and who was like murdered on his way to school.
There were multiple children murdered by the occupation this week. I heard nothing about it from any major media source. All of the regular Middle Eastern sources did their best to cover it, but I didn't hear anything like when I heard a gunshot in so-called Tel Aviv. You want to talk about terrorism? Just this morning, a hospital was tear gassed in Jenin, and babies were forced to be moved on incubators because the occupation army let go tear gas inside of a hospital.
Yeah, and wasn't it a few weeks ago that all of the major media outlets were talking about the total lack of humanity of Vladimir Putin because Russia had actually bombed Ukrainian hospitals, and there was a mother who was 9 months pregnant that was on a stretcher, who later we found out had died along with her baby, and everybody was lamenting at just how absolutely sickening it was. And it is sickening.
And it absolutely is.
It is sickening. That's the thing, is it is sickening. And that's all we're asking people to acknowledge, is that this behavior is sickening, period. Not sickening only when it happens to a specific type of person from a specific place. Part of what is so extraordinary about what Palestinians have been asked to endure for the last 70 plus years is that the people who are asking us to lie down and die in the face of occupation are also the same people who would never accept that reality for themselves. They do a really good job of magnifying, when one person is killed, right? When that lone Israeli soldier breaks his ankle or whatever it may be. But when it comes to accepting the magnitude of violence that Palestinians have been forced to endure for decades and decades, These people would never accept that level of violence imposed on them and their communities systematically, as Palestinians have been forced to reckon with. In March alone, the occupation has killed several Palestinian youth. Earlier this month, Israeli soldiers shot and killed 15-year-old Yamin Khanafseh in the occupied Palestinian village of Abu Dis in occupied Jerusalem. And Israeli soldiers then shot tear gas in an ambulance which was trying to reach the child, preventing the ambulance from reaching him. It's a common tactic. They do this all the time. Not only do they commit outright acts of violence towards Palestinian children, but then they will often obstruct medical professionals from reaching those who they have injured, which often leads to greater injury or death. Israeli soldiers also shot and killed 19-year-old Karim Jamal al-Khawsami near the Bab Hutta gate at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. He was the first of 2 Palestinian teenagers that were killed by the occupation in under 24 hours. Karim was from the neighborhood of Al-Tur in occupied Jerusalem, where, of course, we know that the occupation has been forcibly expelling Palestinians from their homes in order to replace them with Israeli settlers.
Israeli soldiers invaded the Kalandia refugee camp and opened fire on Palestinians, shooting Ala Muhammad Shaham in the head, killing and wounding at least 6 others. This is 2 weeks ago. In the Balata refugee camp, Israeli soldiers shot 16-year-old Nader Haytham Rayan with several bullets to the head, chest, and hand, killing him. Israeli soldiers shot and killed Sanad Salem al-Harbad after invading the city of Rahat. He leaves behind 3 children. This is a daily reality for Palestinians. To wake up to another death, another shooting, another murder, another assassination of someone who looks just like you, of someone who you may be related to, of somebody who you probably loved. They were a part of your family. Every single day, Palestinians are murdered by the occupation. Every single day, Palestinians wake up and hear about somebody they love dying.
Itamar Ben-Gvir has toured Al-Aqsa Mosque in other news under Israeli police protection, which is interesting because an act of this sort was literally the impetus for the second Intifada, right?
Right.
And now you have, in days before Ramadan in 2022, Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the most extreme Zionist politicians, doing the exact same thing, essentially, that Ariel Sharon did many years ago, the provocation that led to resistance that was the second Intifada. I want to say, Michael, that I have been in contact with some Palestinian friends that are on the ground. I also spoke to Qahir, who we had on the show over the summer, and everyone has echoed the same sentiment, and that is that people are very concerned that this Ramadan is going to lead to another outbreak of just heightened aggression by Israel on Palestinians. We know that oftentimes during our religious holidays, Israel takes that as an opportunity to increase its state violence on us. We saw that very well last year during the end of Ramadan, or towards the end of Ramadan, when Israel started by provoking Palestinians by essentially shooting and tear gassing and firing on Al-Aqsa Mosque and those wanting to worship there. And then it obviously led to the shelling that we saw in Gaza and the killing of hundreds of Palestinians and the decimation of so much infrastructure in Gaza. And now we're here almost a year from those events. And a lot of people have just been sensing, a lot of people have been very uneasy, on edge, and sensing that Israel is going to take this Ramadan as another opportunity to just go insane again, like they did last year. And actually, like, as I was researching this morning for this episode, I started to see that Naftali Bennett was already starting to refer to the latest sort of wave of, of resistance by, and the Israeli response to it by one of their operation names. I don't know if you caught that. I already gave it a name. Operation Break the Wave.
Break the Wave.
Yes.
They
exactly.
hate surfers.
Exactly. I wish that's what it was. But literally, Naftali Bennett came out yesterday and was like, citizens of Israel, we are experiencing a wave of murderous terrorism. And just like in all previous waves, we will prevail together. And then he announced that the response was going to be called Operation Break the Wave.
Yeah. And there is a politician who went on their national media and threatened another Nakba as well, right? They're like, we know what we could do. We could take this to its logical conclusion, and what's going to happen is another Nakba. So watch out, which, you know, it's always nice to hear them vacillate between it never happened and we'll do it again.
I think it's worth actually reading the quote from the former Israeli Army General Uzi Dayan, where
Go
he
ahead.
promises a second Nakba.
Read it.
So earlier this week, Uzi Dayan, a former Israeli army general and member of Israel's parliament, warned Palestinians of another Nakba. When Palestinians say that we are being ethnically cleansed, we are being killed in mass for a specific purpose, which is to remove us from our land and replace us with settlers. We're not saying this because like we think it's, you know, commentary. We're saying this because they've already done it. Like mostly, they've already like in large part carried out this campaign of ethnic cleansing when they expelled and or murdered the majority of us from our homes in 1948. And then when they go ahead and deny it, they simultaneously also promise to do it again. And it just leaves us in this like mental space where we don't even know what we have to, like, we don't even know how to defend ourselves, or, you know, we don't even know how to respond, because it's like, on the one hand, we're being murdered, you're murdering, but you're also denying that you're murdering, but you're also promising to murder again. And it's just a very twisted reality that they have created, where they can at once be free from the guilt of being ethnic cleansers and colonizers by denying that they've done anything, but they can also continue to be colonizers and ethnic cleansers by committing this act of violence. And it's like Palestinians have to live in the intellectual reality that Zionists have created. And part of what we do, at least on the Palestine pod, and part of what a lot, you know, the work of a lot of Palestinian activists has been to say, this is not real. The reality that you have created, Zionists, is not real. It's not rooted in facts and what's actually happening. It's an imagined reality that exists only in your brain. And it exists for the purpose of making you feel okay about the fact that you're a colonizer. Right? It exists so that you can like wake up every day and live with yourself, because the only way you could do that is if you know, believe that you were not an ethnic cleanser, believe that you weren't a colonizer, believe that you didn't carry out the Nakba, right? But then there are moments like glitches in the system where they throw that all away and then they say, we're going to do it again. You know, it's like, okay.
Yeah.
So he comes on and says, he goes, quote, "The thing we need to tell the Arab community, even those who didn't participate in the attacks, is to be careful. If we reach a civil war situation, things will end in one word, and a situation you know, which is Nakba," he added. "This is what will happen in the end." So, a lot of interesting things to unpack here. On the one hand, he is speaking about a possible civil war situation. So, like, if you're speaking about a civil war, part of you is acknowledging that not only do we exist, but that we're part of you, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't have a civil war if it's not from within. So not only do you acknowledge that we exist, but you acknowledge that we exist and we're in the same space.
Also, it acknowledges you as civil, right? Because you can't have a civil war if you're uncivilized.
Exactly.
Civil war. It's in the title, right?
It's in the title. But this is interesting because the whole premise of Israel is that not only do we not exist, but that we can't be part of this state. We're not allowed to because we're not Jewish. But now he's saying there might be a civil war. Civil war between who? Not Jews and Jews. He's saying civil war between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, that's interesting. But then obviously what's even more interesting is that he says things will end in one word, in a situation you know because we've already done it to you, which is Nakba. That's what will happen in the end. So he even calls it by what we know it as. So what that does to me is it is validation in the purest form. We're not exaggerating. We've never exaggerated or lied or embellished any of this, this reality, the reality of the Nakba, because they tell us very clearly in certain moments where the truth comes out that they have done it to us and they threaten to do it again.
Yeah, when they take a moment off chanting death to Arabs in the street, they're very poignant in their interviews.
It's so brazen. The thing we need to tell the Arab community, even those who didn't participate in the attacks, is to be careful.
What a weird thing to say.
And also, like, even those who didn't participate in the attack. So what you're saying is you are threatening genocide of an entire people, resisting or not resisting, because they can't be in the same space that you are now coming to inhabit, despite the fact that they were already there. Because, by the way, civil war, right?
And so, by your own definition, did nothing wrong.
Exactly. To be able to speak with that amount of violence, like in your words, is really, truly and to believe that, it's really remarkable. And by the way, Operation Break the Wave, part of that operation was what you saw in Jenin when they stormed, amongst other things, that hospital, and they ended up firing tear gas onto essentially a neonatal unit, and incubators had to be moved containing preemie babies. That is part of their Operation Break the Wave.
Hey, remember when a woman went and testified in front of the United Nations and was like, they've taken babies out of incubators?
I know exactly what you're talking about. This was during the Gulf War when they spread that totally false propaganda that Iraq was taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators, and they did it to arouse hysteria.
Yes.
So that then
they could justify the occupation.
Exactly, so that they could justify essentially sending U.S. troops over to Kuwait and engaging and supporting in the fight against Saddam Hussein. They had to arouse American, emotions and fear and disgust, because otherwise, why would we go over to that part of the world and meddle ourselves in their affairs anyway? There's no reason for it, right?
Most Americans were like, what is Kuwait?
So Israel announced that it has now allocated 181 million shekels to the Israeli police in response to the quote-unquote latest terror wave. The money is going to be used for strengthening the police's ability to tighten security across the country, particularly with respect to establishing a quote-unquote Shin Bet brigade made up of reservists, the addition of 200 soldiers to the border police, and more protective equipment. Have you ever seen an Israeli soldier?
Yeah, they seem pretty decked out and stuff. They look like Ninja Turtles weaponized.
100%. Do they need more equipment? Where would they even put it?
Also, they keep talking about how they're the most secure place in the world for Jews to live. Why is it that they feel like they need a recommitment to security if they're already secure? It makes no sense.
100%. This is also a very strange thing, and that is that what Bennett said when this measure was announced, just the creepiest quote ever. You can add it to the list of creepy things Zionists have said. He said, quote, "We are fixing a grave mistake, the neglect of Israel police. A strong Israel police is a strong Israel."
That guy's parents are from Berkeley.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so weird too when he equates the strength of the country by how many weapons its police have.
Yeah. Strong police is good. It's dude, this is 1990s tough on crime, right? Type of mentality that, just really means incarcerating and terrorizing the lives of underserved communities.
Exactly. The Middle East Eye reported on March 31st, 3 Palestinians were killed this week by Israeli fire in separate incidents all across the occupied West Bank. So in one morning raid on Jenin, Israeli soldiers shot and killed 2 Palestinians. Their names are Sened Abu Atiyah, who was 17, and Yazid Zaidi, 23. And then in the southern West Bank city of Bethlehem, a third Palestinian was killed after reportedly attempting to stab an Israeli. The army also raided the Jenin refugee camp, and the army raid prompted civilians in the Jenin camp to carry out confrontations with soldiers. There was actually a gun battle that took place with Palestinian resistance fighters from the Jenin camp against the Israeli soldiers. Of the Palestinian casualties, only one suffered an injury in the exchange of fire. The rest were shot while they were throwing rocks. So again, we have this scenario that plays out over and over again, where you have Palestinians who are literally throwing rocks, and that's a literal statement, and then fully equipped Israeli military, which is carrying out aggression against them and may injure them or kill them. So the Palestinian from Bethlehem who was killed, his name is Nadal Jafara. He was fatally shot by an armed Israeli bus passenger. So that is a civilian. That is an Israeli civilian who has killed the Palestinian from Bethlehem. Now, this is interesting because in the wake of all of this, Naftali Bennett has also called on gun owners in Israel to arm themselves in public following the attacks. If you have ever gone to visit Palestine, one of the easiest ways to tell a Palestinian from an Israeli is that Israelis walk around with visible weapons.
Yeah.
All the time. Civilians walk around with visible guns all the time. You can see it anywhere you go. And it's such a normal part of Israeli society. And so Naftali Bennett is basically doubling down on this cultural phenomenon and calling on gun owners to arm themselves in public.
Meanwhile, they'll be like, how could you target civilians? It's like, well, the civilian had a semi-automatic pistol.
So Passover is coming up, right?
Yes, Passover is coming up.
Israeli authorities have announced that they will also allow police-protected settlers to enter Al-Aqsa Mosque in mass during Passover, which will fall during Ramadan.
They've also started to implement a strategy that will limit the amount of Muslims who are allowed to access Al-Aqsa during Ramadan.
I mean, it just sounds like they're trying to create the conditions, the same conditions of provocation that we saw last year.
It was last year at the Damascus Gate where they tried to limit people's ability to access the mosque. And they're doing the exact same thing, just like they have every single year, because they take these opportunities to try and stamp out Palestinian joy.
Definitely. It is weird how their leader, even announced this measure. He says, Bennett said, "What is expected of you, Israeli citizens? Vigilance and responsibility. Whoever has a gun license, this is the time to carry a gun."
Overwhelmingly, Palestinians don't resist violently. Largely.
That's the thing.
Largely, Palestinian resistance is mostly nonviolent. And then occasionally, sometimes people pop off and it's like Palestinians all across the spectrum get punished, collective punishment, because a few people decided that 70 years of oppression was too much.
Yeah. U.S. senators urged the U.S. to halt UN probe into alleged war crimes during Gaza bombing. 68 senators signed a letter sent to President Biden saying that the UN investigation is part of, quote unquote, continuing bias against Israel. I have a problem with this because if you are obstructing justice, then that's like it's so bizarre, because what these senators have done is they are, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, obstructing justice. They are, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, preventing an investigation from taking place.
I bet you if we looked at those 68 senators' donation receipts, you'd find AIPAC, J Street, any number of Zionist organizations that have a serious command over their votes.
That the majority, I'm willing to bet that the majority of those senators who signed take very hefty donations from Zionist lobbies. But the premise that you can just say, no, we don't need to do an investigation, Because if we were to do one that's anti-Semitic, and because that's singling out Israel, well, what other country in the world do we say, no, 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 we don't need to do an investigation because to do so would be anti that country or anti the religion of the people practiced by that country? That doesn't make any sense. That in and of
Yeah.
itself is singling out Israel and treating it as a special case and saying that we can't even investigate allegations of war crimes. Why?
Yeah. It makes no
On
sense.
what basis? On what basis? Especially when you have in the same Newsweek as this article comes out saying that U.S. senators are urging the Biden administration to interfere with the UN probe into Israel's alleged war crimes in Gaza. In the same Newsweek, we have an Israeli general promising a second Nakba,
Yeah.
which is not the first time that they promise a second Nakba. It happens all the time.
Pretty frequently.
So how can these two realities exist? How can you have on the one hand people saying, no, 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 don't single out Israel. That's just anti-Semitism. They didn't do anything. Or are they saying that even if they did something, it wouldn't matter because they have to be infallible in order for us not to be anti-Semitic?
It reminds me of when that Israeli MK said Ben Gurion, quote, didn't finish the job of ethnic cleansing Palestinians. And then that same week, there was an op-ed that was like, calling Israeli attacks on Palestinians settler violence is anti-Semitic opinion. And it's like, what are we doing here?
It's two very different realities that exist at once in the same news cycle, and they can't both be true. But one of them, we know for a fact is true because the guy said it. Like he said it. You know what I mean? Like he said it. So
he did say it.
You don't have to believe us. You don't have to believe us who have grandparents whose family members were killed or expelled during the Nakba. You don't have to believe us. Believe the perpetrators who are promising to do it again.
Yeah, those people are very much like resistance for me, but not thee. Right?
Is that a quote?
No, that's just something I made up, but probably the episode
That's
title
just
name.
you. Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
They be inside Ukraine talking about Palestinians are committing terrorism. It's like you flew to the Ukraine to fire guns on an occupation.
Yeah.
Didn't you? Didn't you go there to be a sniper? Okay. Sounds good. Where are you from?
Insane.
Colorado? Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great. You've been living in Palestine? Okay. You 2 years in Palestine as a settler? Okay. Now you're a sniper in Ukraine. Palestinians all across the world commemorated Land Day. Friend of the show, pod alum Nirdin Kiswani, organized a brilliant protest in the streets of New York. Shouts out to her and all of her efforts at Wool.
And for those of you who don't know, Land Day commemorates an event which took place in 1976, where in response to the Israeli government's announcement of a plan to expropriate thousands of dunams of Palestinian land and take it over for the Israeli state, Palestinians launched a general strike and marches were organized all throughout Palestine, including 48. And there were confrontations between the occupation and Palestinian resistance fighters, during which 6 unarmed Palestinians were killed and upwards of 100 were injured. And Israel also during this time arrested Palestinians in the hundreds, participating in the strikes, whatever it may be, or even as a means of collective punishment if they were suspected to have done so, or not at all. And Land Day it's probably lesser known than the events that commemorate the Nakba, which is also tied to the establishment of the state of Israel. It's equally as important because what Land Day symbolizes is also, in the same way that the Nakba does, the ethnic cleansing itself, right? The land theft. The Nakba refers to the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population in 1948, and it is still ongoing because Palestinians continue to be expelled from their homes. But Land Day gets at the heart of what is at stake, and that is the land itself, right? When Palestinians were expelled from their homes during the Nakba of 1948 and until today, what the Zionists were interested in was the land that their homes were on, and that's what they took over. And so Land Day is an equally important symbol of Palestinian resistance, which is why Palestinians continue to commemorate it every year on March 30th. And it's really commemorated by Palestinians all over the world as just one of the major moments of Palestinian unity and resistance to Israeli occupation.
Yeah. Bennett keeps talking about that new wave of terrorism, and Land Day commemorates the old wave of terrorism.
Bingo. That was so good.
Well, Israel arrested a number of Palestinian municipal candidates as well. A third Palestinian municipal elections candidate has been arrested in the city of Dura after being summoned for interrogation, raising fears that the Israeli authorities are trying to sabotage the process of elections before voters even go to the polls.
Israel sabotage Palestinian elections?
That doesn't
Never.
sound like them.
Like, it is an interesting dynamic where we're not allowed to run in municipal elections either. So what are we supposed to do?
They'll be like, hey, Palestinians need to elect better leadership and then arrest their leaders.
You know, some of our best leaders are in jail.
Of course.
So
anybody
there
who
you
really
go.
tries to lead Palestinians in a way that would bring them at all closer to liberation is either incarcerated or dead. And then they have the gall to be like, and we'll do it again. And I do it again.
Yeah.
Like, why is this? We have a security problem. Come through to the most secure place for Jews in the world, but also we need to recommit ourselves to security.
I'm sorry. It's so funny. It's so funny.
Those are the same people who are like, I'm triggered by literal teenagers in college doing organizing. I feel unsafe in these spaces. Meanwhile, it's like, they're like, I'm a brave Judean warrior. I'm a lion. Rawr. So anyways, the three candidates who've been arrested are Ishmael Awada, a candidate on the Unity and Professional Development list, was arrested. The other candidates are Islam Al-Tawil, head of the Al-Bira Unites Us list, and Abdul Karim Farah, head of the Loyalty to Hebron list. The arrest of three Palestinian candidates that took place recently is on the backdrop of a general rise in unlawful and unnecessary detentions of Palestinians by the occupation, numbering as many as 20 to 30 arrests per day, according to human rights organizations. And we also remember that Blue Wolf update that was like, they need to start cataloging at least 50 Palestinians per day, basically, to meet their new quota. And many of those arrested and released a few days later reported that interrogators made threats meant to dissuade them from participating in municipal elections, either as candidates or voters. Khaled Fakwa, a Unity and Professional Development candidate, told Middle East Eye that Ishmael Awada was second on the list and was chosen because of his 25 years of experience as an architect in the municipality. Israel wanted to arrest Ishmael in order to send a message to us to back down from participation in this arena, and it wants to sabotage any election that may result in national unity, Khalid said.
The Israel lobby has come for low-key.
They are attempting to smear low-key as anti-Semitic, which we know is their number one favorite thing to do in the world, and they're trying to get his music taken off of Spotify.
Yeah.
Now, if you know low-key, you know that he is a long-standing ally to the Palestinian cause, one of the most eloquent and poignant speakers that is not Palestinian in the UK, and really leading the charge for Palestinian liberation, both through his lyrics, his activism, and even his scholastic work. And the lobby in the UK, the Zionist lobby, is now attempting to rob him of his livelihood, smear his name, and tarnish his reputation, which is impeccable.
I love how you said that. Even before they did this, though, he was scheduled to speak on March 15th by Zoom at a talk organized by the Palestine Solidarity Society at Cambridge University. The talk was entitled "The Israel Lobby's War Against You." The night before it was scheduled, however, Loki was contacted by the organizers who told him that the event had been postponed. The postponement, of course, was due to pressure exerted by the Cambridge University Jewish Society. The group basically alleged that Loki has, quote unquote, repeatedly used unfounded conspiracy theories and harmful arguments about the Israel lobby to attack the British Jewish community, often in a way that undermines the lived experiences and realities of Jewish students, end quote. That's kind of weird because we all know about that documentary that came out by Al Jazeera revealing that all the ways in which the Israel lobbies function. I mean, using actually like clipped material that was recorded undercover. Loki's not exaggerating anything. He, if anything, is revealing how these organizations function, and it's not anything that he doesn't have support for or sources for. You can actually look up the Al Jazeera documentary and hear the Israeli lobby talking about the ways in which they're going to organize to smear Palestinian activists, to censor them, to get their events canceled, to promote Zionist propaganda, to try to confuse people and swindle them into supporting Israel.
Yeah, and the best way to persuade someone that you don't have disproportionate influence over world events is to get their event canceled the night before.
The Electronic Intifada reported that the organization, which managed to get Loki's event postponed, is one among 70 groups that comprise the quote-unquote Union of Jewish Students. And that Union of Jewish Students was that organization that was actually featured in the 2017 Al Jazeera documentary, which mentioned that this group was financed by the Israeli embassy in London. So you have basically, just to summarize, a group which is part of a larger group, which is financed by the Israeli government, which is responsible for interfering to cancel Loki's talk at Cambridge University.
Interfering in college events in the UK. Hey, what part of the UK is Israel? You know what I mean?
Right?
Just the Balfour? I don't know.
Yeah.
I know which part of the UK belongs to the occupation, and it's 10 Downing Street.
There you go.
That's a deep cut if you're an American. That's where their politics go on. It's like our J Street, or no, it's like our what's the street with all the lobbyists? K Street? It's like our street with all the lobbyists in DC, which is actually every street, believe it or not. So
the treatment of Loki is obviously contrasted to how Cambridge University hosted Sipni Hatavli, Israel's ambassador to the UK last month. And despite the fact that Palestinian groups protested, the event went ahead as planned. Obviously, we are dealing with clear double standards here. The situation is even more grave because the woman who was hosted by Cambridge University last month is a representative of an apartheid state, right?
Yes.
So on the one hand, you have Loki, whose track record in fighting against all forms of racism is, crystal clear. And on the other hand, you have a literal representative of an apartheid state who was allowed to speak at Cambridge University. So what does that say about Cambridge University and its values? It's really unfortunate. And now, of course, as you mentioned, Michael, what the Zionist lobby is attempting to do is to get Loki's music removed off of Spotify. So he has launched a petition. You can find the petition in his link in bio on Instagram to support him and basically say to Spotify, like, don't give in to this pressure from the Israel lobby. Don't take his music off of Spotify. And a bunch of prominent people have already signed, including Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, all of the usual suspects in the music industry that support Palestinian human rights. Definitely go check it out, sign it, send it to your friends, make sure they sign it as well.
Yes, it's an example of free speech for me, but not for thee.
I just want to mention, because Mondoweiss, I love what they're doing. They have literally been keeping track every single day. They have been counting the days that the New York Times has not mentioned the amnesty report.
Mm-hmm.
And last week, they published an article. New York Times gives in to widespread criticism and mentions amnesty report on Israeli apartheid 52 days late. Love that.
That's great.
So they mentioned it 52 days late, and what did they say? They're
like, we don't agree with it.
Yeah.
They just publish Israeli propaganda 52 days late.
Yeah. No, so basically what they did was Jerusalem Bureau Chief Patrick Kinsley used another apartheid report, the one that came out after the amnesty report, the one by the UN Special Rapporteur, to finally slip in the amnesty report. Kingsley wrote that a Canadian law professor appointed by the UN Human Rights Council had, quote, accused Israel of committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied territories. He quickly summarized the law professor's findings, gave Israel's foreign ministry and other critics a chance to respond, and then, right at the end, mentioned briefly that Amnesty, amongst others, had produced a quote-unquote similar report. It is amazing how organizations like the New York Times are able to shape the public consciousness and dismiss and erase something like the amnesty report, which honestly was the biggest deal in terms of reports that say Israel is an apartheid state. Out of all the ones that had come out thus far, I think that is the one that really did make the biggest impact in terms of the discussions that were had and the public response to it. And so the fact that they could just ignore it for 52 days and then just slip it in as a quote unquote similar finding is really, I mean, it's incredible. It's honestly bad faith.
Yeah. Can you imagine the people at Human Rights Watch like, dude, what the fuck?
Yeah.
All right, folks. And that has been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Find us on our website, www.palestinepod.com. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. Check us out on Instagram at The Palestine Pod. And please check us out on Patreon. We got a bunch of cool things cooking over there. www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great day.